Welcome to the stream. So, today our guest is Sander, and I will add him to the stream using our new system. Here we have him. And I will turn off all my other stuff. YouTube seems to be working, LinkedIn seems to be working, everything seems to be working. That's cool. All right. Welcome, Sander. Can you hear?
Hello. Yes, I can hear you. Yeah.
All right, cool. Let me just see here so people also know who I am. All right, so anyone who's watching, please leave a comment that is working on Facebook, LinkedIn, and YouTube. It should pop up on this supposedly fancy system of ours. So, Sandor, you are also a lighting artist. Which view should we go for, by the way? Should we go for this view or this view?
Either is fine. I think the second one is quite nice. I like that aspect ratio.
All right, so we can stick to this one then, or this one?
Yeah, that one. No, that one is good. Yeah.
Okay, cool. All right, so Sander, you've been going on for a bit as a lighting artist, and you obviously have done a lot of projects, and unfortunately, you have a lot of NDA projects. So you're able to show a lot of the great stuff you have been doing. So it comes down to having the conversation so people know about yourself and your experience. So tell us about yourself, Sander.
So yeah, that's right. So I'm Sander, and I only started doing lighting 4 years ago, which is not too long ago. Like straight out of college, I started doing lighting, and I immediately fell in love with the art form, right? Because basically what we are doing, and this is something that my lead said to me back in the day, and that has really stuck with me. Lighting is kind of, you're basically a presentation artist, because you're basically like showing off the work of other people and trying to make the game look as good as possible while also enhancing the gameplay for it. Which is really why I like this a lot. Like this kind of process of like going around like making it look as good as we can. Yeah, so I started off in Electric Square doing my internship there. I worked on Forza Street, which is a released mobile game, which I basically learned everything on from scratch about lighting. And now I'm working on indeed an NDA project, which I can't really go into about, but it's really it's a really cool project.
Cool. You already have a difficult question, I see, from one of the viewers, but you don't have to answer it software specific unless you actually know Arnold interior rendering. But you have a question already. So in terms of the question, we'll answer them and we'll ask them as we go with the show, just to keep it fluid and include you guys. So feel free to ask questions, and I'm happy to interrupt myself and ask the questions after asking some questions to Sander first. So I guess we can take Nikhil's question, and I guess if we rephrase it a bit, software agnostic, I guess is the word. Can you talk a little bit about realistic lighting setup or realistic photography render? Funny enough, Sander was actually teaching me a little bit about a realistic lighting before the show. So he definitely has. He's definitely a realistic lighting person compared to me, who is more stylized. So, what would you say is the key things to think about when doing realistic lighting?
So I'm to answer Nikhil's question, I'm not really familiar with Arnold and Maya. I have used it a few times to like VizDev some things, but my main preferred weapon of choice is Unreal. But that doesn't take away that you also need to keep in mind the core values of lighting, like the to me, what makes a photorealistic lighting setup and what makes it easier to set something up like that is to adhere to physical values. And physical values are basically the real photometric data of lighting, like how does light behave, how bright is it, what color is it. Because if you set it up that way, then you can, if you render, you can apply the fundamentals of photography on it. all of this data is also like known online. So you can find, for example, the brightness of certain light bulbs. If you know your desk lamp is a certain lumen intensity, then you can find that online, and you can completely recreate that digitally. And that way you can just like use real photo camera settings like aperture, shutter speed, and ISO in order to make those realistic renderings. So what I would do for a realistic lighting setup, I would first start off, and that's actually what I do for any lighting setup. I would start off with my main key light, and in most cases, no matter what it is, except if you're like in dark dungeons or anything, or in like caves, start with natural light, because natural light is really important, and most of the times it is a big part of your scene in general. So for like an interior, like a room, for example, my room, my key light would be the windows. And I would start off with that, and then I would start adding in local lights with the photometric data that I find.
Cool. So before I take in more questions, just keep writing questions. I'll read them up as we go. So I do think we should talk a little bit about your time from being a student, what you originally were doing, and your path from all of the choices you made so far that led you to Studio Gobo. And I want to emphasize any challenges, confusion, changing your schedule or plans, so people who are going through a similar life situation right now gain some motivation, some guidance, some hope, because it is not easy to get into a studio. It's not easy to stop doing something and then choosing another path. So let's talk a little bit about that from that point of view.
So from a motivation point of view, I actually started off so in high school I studied economics, and that was something I did because I really didn't know what to do. And that was probably not the best decision, because I was always that kid that was sat in the back of the class drawing on whatever sheet of paper that I could find. And yeah, I thought that needed to change, and also my parents did. So at one point they introduced me to this really awesome course in Belgium, which is called Digital Arts and Entertainment. So we went to check it out. I instantly fell in love, and I was, yeah, this is what I want to do. And it was quite crazy as well for my parents to see this, because they weren't really like acknowledged. I mean, they didn't really like know the whole game atmosphere. They didn't know what 3D was and how this all was working. So it was really like eye-opening for them to see, and that there's definitely a career to be made there. It would be wrong to like say that they completely blocked me of doing anything with computers and games. They basically like they supported me in every possible way to do what I wanted to do. So that was definitely great. I know that there's people that aren't as lucky as me in this sense. But I would say never give up your dreams, because there's definitely like a career to be made in this industry, and we need a lot of really good lighting people. So definitely keep on going for that. So when I actually went to that college, I always thought I wanted to become a concept artist, because I really liked the aesthetics of paintings, like how light plays in paintings. But I was also like a huge comic book fan back in the day, and I used to read like mangas and whatever. So I wanted to like draw all of this stuff. But eventually I realized I was actually not very good at drawing. And I found my new passion, which was 3D art. So I started specializing in 3D art, into making just 3D scenes. I really loved level art and decoration, which are all courses that we got throughout our college. In the first year, we actually got a creativity course, which was basically like a choose your own subject kind of thing. It was only like a few days, but it was pretty cool, because it kind of made you do some things that weren't really related to games, but kind of were. And one of those things were photography. And that's where I picked up a camera. And to be honest, I'm so glad I did, because from photography, I've learned probably like my most valuable lessons about lighting and understanding how light works in real life and how exposure works and all of these kind of things, because it cannot be underestimated how important photography is for making realistic scenes and lighting setups in that sense. So back then, even when I did photography, I wasn't entirely sure if I wanted to do lighting yet. And that only started in my internship when I came into the studio, Studio Gobo. And they said to me, "Hey, Sander, we don't have a lighting artist. Do you want to do this for us?" And I was like, "Yeah, sure." Even though I didn't know anything about lighting and those values at all, I spent a few months learning everything, like devouring every piece of information I could find online, and try to like write up guides and papers and stuff for our studio to like document all of this information. And I think I fell in love again with the art of what lighting is and how you can use it for making your game look nice. And yeah, that's basically where I am at right now. Like one project further, I'm working as a full-time lighting artist in Studio Gobo.
So I think it's interesting to also think about that you were originally playing on concept artists, and what I've noticed so far with some of my interviews and some of the one I'm having next week as well is a lot of people come from a concept artist background, of the people who are still very new from being a lighting artist or in the industry, and other people that I've seen who are also new are like coming from an environmental artist backgrounds. It's an interesting pattern I'm starting to notice from the interviews. But a common thing for people to know that if anyone were to transition over to a lighting artist, because let's say they don't want to give up, let's say they don't like 3D modeling, but they do have the similar backgrounds like you, or photography for that matter, what are the skills that you think a good lighting artist should know?
So for me, I think like I mentioned before, photography was definitely like one of the things that I think is kind of a must to pick up for lighting artists in general. Just because you learn so much about like values and like exposure and how everything works, how lights interact with each other. So I said this before to someone else, that the most important tool for lighting artists is their eyes. So you have to like develop an eye for these kind of things, and developing an eye, as with most art forms, is quite a long process. You have to basically like understand why something looks a certain way, and that needs to become a gut feeling, and that's what I mean with developing an eye. So yeah, basically making loads and loads of pictures, try and make them look as good as possible, play with color, and developing an eye for that. That's, to me, that's my most important skill. It's not all the technical stuff. It's actually getting the feeling that something looks right or something doesn't right, and knowing how to fix it.
Cool. So let's see. I'll try and answer Sergio's question from a couple of minutes ago. What is the main challenge that you face during production as lighting artist?
That's a good question, I think, because I think that will vary from person to person. I would say balancing is basically like walking the fine line between design and art, because for design, obviously everything needs to be bright enough, and for art, we want to make everything look good enough. But sometimes you just want that extra level of contrast or extra level of darkness to to get that moodiness. That's something that's hard to like translate to the whole team, because not everyone has like nice monitors as well, and we know the end consumer doesn't have nice monitors as well, and that's kind of hard for me to like sometimes mitigate this, because I've got like a really nice, very high dynamic range display, but not everyone has that, and like trying to like find the fine line where art ends and design stops, and try to like make the two ends meet together. That's for me like a kind of a thing that is quite challenging to do in a proper production, and like also convey this information to other people in the team, and like get that feedback and try to apply it in that sense to enhance the gameplay, I think.
So let's follow up on the question, and let's ask you, what's a typical day, like in a day or in a week? Like, what are the tasks and challenges and communication you go through for your job right
So
now?
So my day usually depends on what stage of production we are in. And obviously with COVID, everything changed very drastically. But let's just say before COVID, what I would do is just obviously go into the office, start with a cup of coffee because I'm really not a morning person and I really need my coffee. And then what I would usually start off with is, first of all, we have a stand up, which is kind of like a short meeting where everyone in the team says, okay, I'm going to be working on this, this, and this, or I'm blocked by this and this. And that's a good thing because I'm one of the few lighting artists in our office. And I'm usually like involved in those stand-ups with environment people, with designer people. So I basically have like a broad overview of what everyone is working on at that time, what are their blockers, and kind of like see if there's something that I can do for in the lighting front. Like, oh, it's maybe a bit too dark in that area. Maybe I need to brighten the ambience a bit more. That's something that we start off with, which is good because then I know what I can do throughout the day. And then I would start working, and depending on what stage in production process, that's where this body of work changes. Because in pre-production, I would mainly like set up systems, find what kind of style for lighting we want to do, set up mood boards, make color scripts for a game, and basically like identify the issues before they arise, so we can make sure that during production we don't really have that many issues, and it should be smooth sailing from there on. But in reality, it never really is. But sure, that's what we do in pre-production: set up systems, set up just general your light sets, and defining these set of rules for the entire team to work with. Writing up documentation is a big one as well, especially if you're one of the few lighting artists, and if your environment art team needs to do some lighting as well. That's where documentation comes in really, really handy. Then after that, so during production, then there's just a whole bunch of lighting, color grading, doing exposure settings, doing all of that stuff during the day-to-day.
So, what would you say you were lucky in terms of, getting into a studio to be a lighting artist, or would you say it was a bit difficult for you in terms of, I don't know, fail interviews or getting a lot of no's, or it was more of a trainee opportunity or internship opportunity?
So I am still at Studio Gobo, as you can see on my title card. So I haven't really like jumped around a whole lot. So the way it worked for me was that it was mainly a training kind of opportunity, as in they said, oh, we need a lighting artist. Can you do this for us? Can you learn all the skills that are required for it? And then I basically like developed my skills for that. And I guess they must be happy because I'm still here. But
Nice.
I would say, since there is such a shortage on really good lighting artists in the industry, I would say that if you stand out a bit, I don't think it won't be too much trouble to find something, I think.
Okay. So,
'Cause
how do you stand out, though? How do you stand out?
how do you stand out? To me, like if someone would apply to our studio, to me that would be having a correct understanding of lighting, how it works, and obviously like a good portfolio. Like portfolio is probably key, but also like show that you know and understand why you're making certain decisions, how you're doing your setup. That's to me quite important, because there's quite a lot of people that if they make a lighting setup, they go quite messy, and like they go that like just the general setup that needs to be clean and solid. Because if you want to like build further on that, especially in like a dynamic scenario like a game, you do want like a clean setup and something that is easy to understand for everyone that just jumps into your scene. That's something that to me, if you would want to stand out, that would stand out to me.
I mean, yeah, I guess so, because a lot of people they do lighting and they're just moving the sliders and stuff, and they don't really know why they're doing it, but they're just waiting for it to look kind of what they want, right? Okay.
So that's actually where I think physical value. Where I'm a quite big proponent of physical values, because you have like a base and you can work from this base. And if you work from that base, it's like a common knowledge pool that is everywhere. You can find all of this information online. And if you set up your lighting that way, you know that other people can understand this as well, because there's a bunch of all of this information online.
So before we continue on the PBR base, because I know you wanted to talk a bit more about these topics, I want to go back a little bit because you mentioned about Moodboard and color script. What does that entail? What does that mean? And how do you do it?
So that also would depend from project to project, right? Usually, you would work really, really close together with your art lead or art director for the project, and find a way to like translate what the art director wants and put this on a document. So what I would do is first find what is the story for this level, like maybe ping the story team or the environment team or whatever team that is involved with an environment, and then I would start building a color script based on what their input is on that. And what I would do is go on Pinterest and like find stuff with the keywords that I have for that specific scenario, and then find the information that I want and find the pictures that I want, and then put it in Photoshop. There's this really handy thing in Photoshop that I use quite often. Like what I would do is I would drag the picture in Photoshop. I would completely blur the picture with Gaussian blur. And then I would, there's this thing called, I think it's posterize, where you can, oh no, sorry, it's mosaic, where you basically make a mosaic version of that picture. So you have like all the key colors of that picture, and you know, okay, these are the colors that define this picture. So that's how I can, and I like these colors, and then I basically pick them and like put them beneath the picture and say, okay, these colors are the ones that I really, really like for my color script. And then I do that for a few other pictures that I really like. And then obviously they need to like tie together a little bit because you can't get like one picture that's completely red and the other one that's completely pink or something. Like it needs to at least, it needs to like fit together at least a bit.
I use the Tylize filter to do it the same thing.
Yeah, everything that like represents large swathes of color, I think is a really interesting tool. Especially like I feel like art leads and art directors are really fond of seeing a color script that way, like having all these little swaths of color.
I also use average to get like what's
Yep,
the average
yep.
color or tonal value is also something I use.
And then underneath that whole picture setup, then I would start to like write something that comes up into my mind, like, okay, the mood for this, or maybe it's dark and eerie and cold, and I want the atmosphere to be this, and maybe I can do this with the exponential height fog, and just like go slightly into the technical details, but not too far, so we can at least so the art director and the art lead can at least expect something of what your lighting setup might look like.
Right.
But that's how I would like start with a color script or a mood board for that.
Because I know a few senior and lead artists, and we're talking about people far more experienced than both of us combined. They would like if they don't know concept art, because color script, because they're specialists, people who do color script, but they actually do the 2D art as well. So they paint the color script, so you see the characters and everything, which is very common on Pixar. There's a lot of good stuff online for that. But I've seen a couple of other people that I haven't recorded the interviews previously. Is they'll take a picture and that they see the potential of it, and then they go into Photoshop and then they change the color, they change like the mood of the original picture because there's something in the picture that has a good base. Is that something you do, or you just keep it simple?
Yeah, definitely. Okay. Because if you make a color script, it's very hard to find two pictures that have similar colors, or at least like if you say, for example, go back to our red and pink example, like if you find that picture in red and you find that picture in pink, I would probably like shift the color from pink to red and to like make it match a little bit more with the other picture that I have. I mean, obviously, like if there is something in that pink picture that I really like, I wouldn't completely write it off. I would just like change a color, like you suggested.
So what tools do you use inside Photoshop to do that? Because I know we have some technical people who are interested in these kind of things.
Um, so I'm more of a Lightroom person. But if I would do it in Photoshop, I would usually play around with like solid colors and putting it on overlays and like just see whatever blending mode works, and then making masks out of stuff for the sky, or use the exposure adjustment layers, hue, saturation,
So you
brightness, all
really
of
get
this.
into it then basically. You're
Yeah,
like
yeah, yeah.
really getting
Like proper photo
into
editing
proper
on it.
proper like 8 hours work day you're spending making a proper mood board, proper color scripts.
I mean, 8 hours a day is maybe a bit much, depending on the feedback loops from the art director. But yeah, that's kind of what I do. Like I really get into it.
It's not
Like
it's not a 10-minute thing you do. You need
no,
time to do
no.
it.
It
Yeah,
is
okay.
you need so in order to establish your proper mood and color for your game, you definitely want some solid base for that, and
Right.
that's what I do. So I like usually I'd spend like a day or a little more just gathering reference, like loads and loads of reference, and like we talked about it before, building up that visual library, like developing your eye for the stuff you want to achieve. And then like in the following days, I would probably like merge it all together in one document and
That's very
make
cool.
sure that it works. Yeah.
I'm super lucky though, because over at Interior now we have super good 2D team. So most of the concept art is what we end up lighting as well. And if we have to change it, my art director is super awesome. So I'll do like, let's say I do my version inside. In this case, I use Unity. I did it in Unity. He'll ask me to take a screenshot, and then he just does a paint over with the colors I need to change and everything. So I have a pretty chill in that area. I don't have to
Yeah,
do a lot.
we have that as well. We have like brilliant concept artist, and usually we pick his concepts as well as like, okay, this is the guide for our mood. But I always would like support that concept art piece with extra pictures and with the stuff that we described. Like I would also like stylize that shot, so I would see like the main key colors that a concept artist used, and like find, okay, these are the colors I really want to get, and then get supporting pictures with that, because we're still a game, and with one static piece of concept art um, you can't really describe all of the moods of an entire level, because you can look around in every other direction. So
Yeah, in our case, it's an interactive game. So it's like a movie type of game, right? So it's a bit easier to say this room is gonna have this mood and so on. That's good. So let's see. There's another question from Sergi. What's your approach to solve technical issues and negotiate quality and necessary performance?
that's a good question as well. So obviously, like performance is one of the things that always gets back to lighting artists, right? Because lighting is really expensive. But I think this is the case where a more technical lighting artist has like the edge over another lighting artist, and that's what I quite like about what I do as well. Is since I've the only lighting artist on the current project in our studio, I work very closely together with the render tech team, with the engine tech team, and I basically try to proactively make suggestions about certain things. And so in the case of like point lights, okay, we know that I think Red Dead, they have a certain kind of way of having dynamic point light shadows and like caching them together, so you don't have to like update them every frame. They only also cast one dynamic shadow per dynamic object, but they always cast static shadows for static objects. Um, so all of these little optimizations are things you have to like analyze from other games and like see how other people done it, and like listen and be proactive with the render tech team and find ways of optimizing your light setup, or if there's like an optimization that they can make. Um, it's always good to have like this basic understanding of how it basically works under the hood, and like be able to like talk to them um, and like see if they can come up with something to aid you as a lighting artist to like not sacrifice too much quality.
That's cool.
Yeah. So it's like a back and forth, right? Like sometimes it happens that I would have to go back and like turn off spotlight shadows. Sometimes I can afford them. Um, yeah, it's a back and forth, a constant back and forth.
So yeah, it's interesting because I when I do my work right now, I have a bit time to do quality lighting and then come back with feedback that hey, it's too low frame rate. You have to now you have to figure out how to keep the quality, but
Yeah.
but optimize. Like I did this scene this week. It was a party scene, a lot of lights and shadows and fog, and I came back just before I left from work. That hey, dude, it's 13 FPS, dude. I was like, oh shit. So is that something? Do you have to be aware? Do you have to optimize and do the profiling
Yeah. Well,
while you work?
the profiling is done with our tech art team. So our tech art team, they're doing the profiling for us, and they come back with the information for that. I mean, I do have my profiling tools. We have like this really cool
Sorry.
system where
So for people who don't know, when I say profiling and when he says profiling, we're meaning an analytical tool for us checking the frame rates. That's what we're talking about now.
yeah. So basically, we have like tools that tell us how many shadow casting lights are overlapping, and we know that you can only have 4 overlapping spotlights before it starts getting really expensive. So we
Right.
have like basically an idea. Okay, these 4 are overlapping. We should probably like tone those down a bit. Maybe get rid of some of the shadows or some of the spotlights even. Yeah, that's how I profile it on like a basic level. Because profiling from the editor is not ideal because you always have like that overhead of the editor itself, right? So we have the tech art team that does like that makes reports for us and say like, okay, it doesn't perform well here, please fix this. Or we have like these point lights that are casting shadows and that's probably not like a good thing for this area. So yeah, it's like I said, it was a constant back and forth with so the tech art team would come back with those reports and I would go back into the scene and like see if I can tweak anything about it.
So with Unreal 5, because I already asked you, I already gave you a warning, we're going to talk about it as well. So since you mentioned Unreal 5, we can talk a little bit about that as well now. So with Unreal 5, some of us have been talking like in different Discord channels about the future of lighting artists. It's getting easier to light. The math, the science behind it is being done for us. So what is left for us to do? So let's talk about it. Where do you stand when it comes to
So
this?
I'm not really threatened by Unreal 5 being so amazing as it is, because it is amazing. I played around with it yesterday and today, and yeah, it is genuinely really really cool. Um, and I quite enjoy that it's becoming easier for other people to get into lighting because a lot of like the hurdles that I had to go over is like figuring out how GI works, and with Unreal 5, that's basically like a no-brainer. It works with Lumen, but there is still like performance considerations that we need to keep in mind. Like I don't see Unreal 5 shipping with like a proper game for like a plethora of consoles anytime soon. Maybe 5 years. Maybe then we will start seeing full on Unreal games, Unreal 5 games. Because you would still need to provide a solution for lower end devices because the PS4 is still in the running. Xbox One is still is, and I'm not sure because we don't have like any metrics of that, like how Lumen would perform on that, or what other solution that Unreal 5 has for those. So I wouldn't completely write Unreal 4 off entirely, and like the skill set that we have of like how does GI work in certain scenarios and certain engines and certain tools. Um, that's still going to be really really useful knowledge to have. Back to Unreal 5 though now. Even though it became a lot easier, I still think that as a lighting artist will become like even more uh, as a prominent role for a production, because I mean, sure, it is easier to light something, but the technical stuff is always something you can learn. the stuff that we were talking about before, like developing an eye and having a sense for color, having a sense for light placement, composition, those are all things that as a lighting artist is your strongest weapon in your arsenal. And basically, this is where we would be able to focus more on the actual art of the lighting instead of the technicalities of it, and like basically jump out better because all of the technicalities are being taken care of for us. Um, that being said, though, there's still a lot of technicalities that we do need to keep in mind. Like I said, I was a big proponent for physical values. That's still a lot of quite rather technical stuff that you need to know about in order to do proper lighting. Same for exposure, because if you don't understand exposure, and I feel there's still a whole lot of people and a lot of misinformation online about exposure. Like if you type in Unreal Auto Exposure in Google, the first 50 results are how do I turn this off or how do I lock my exposure, which is really not great. I think there should be like a good good documentation or like a good guide on how to do exposure, because it's such an underestimated subject in lighting, and that's where even in Unreal 5 that doesn't happen automatically. So I mean, there is like some kind of automatic exposure system in there, like similar to Unreal 4, but it won't do the exact thing that you would want from it to do. For example, we were talking before this chat about how you would want to make shadows darker than the highlights, because Unreal.
Do you want to show it? Since we're talking
yeah,
about it,
I can show it.
and let's make this even more interesting. Let's show them some stuff.
Share screen.
You will be the first one who is going into the engine to show something technical.
Yeah, sure. So we were talking before this chat about. So can you see my screen?
Yep. Let me just move it into this service. Here we go.
So yeah, we were talking before this chat about exposure and how it works. Like by default, Unreal. Let's just turn all of this stuff off.
This guy's is, by the way, Unreal 5 that he has open.
Beautiful Unreal 5. So out of the box, Unreal 5 exposure will work like this, which looks slightly overexposed when you look straight towards the sun, in the shadow as well. Like we probably don't want our shadows to be this bright. Like if you would put a Macbeth chart in there, the color checker. Let's see if it still works in Unreal. No, it doesn't work in here. But if you would put a color chart in here with and you would see your darks would be washed out. So out of the box, what I would do with Unreal is I would start off setting my exposure compensation to 0, because out of the box, Unreal will always set this to 1. So that means that Unreal is always gonna overcompensate the exposure by 1 EV value. Which is not ideal because it's gonna like overexpose it. We want to start with a clean slate with basically a compensation of 0. Because as you can see at the bottom, we're measuring currently an EV of 11, and Unreal is currently setting the exposure to 10, which is not nice because we have like very, very bright shadows and very, very bright highlights. So I usually turn this back to 0 to start off with. And you'll see our scene gets a lot darker by default, which is obviously like not our desired result, but at least it gives us a clean slate to start off with. So if you look at our histogram here then.
So before you continue, and without going into a lot of detail, because this would be another talk in the future, or even a tutorial, can you quickly show like the measurement for EV using the images of the website and the measurement of lux? So whenever you say it, people know where you are, what information you're referring to, without going into too much detail.
So, like I said, I'm a big proponent. I'm going to keep on repeating myself. I'm a big proponent of physical values because all of this information is stuff you can find online. And these are all like little screenshots of like of sites that I found online. So basically, this is from a photography site that basically says, okay, for a candlelit scene, we want an EV of about 4. For like a church interior or school auditorium, an EV of 5 is good. And you kind of like can guess how it would work in real life. Like if I, for example, would need to light a library, I would probably like stick with an exposure value of like minimum 4, 5, and go up to like 8. So I would stick in this range here.
Yeah.
Unless you would look at direct light. So if the sun would stream in, then I would probably go a bit higher. But if it's like ambiently lit, I would probably like go to an exposure value of between 4 to 8.
Yeah, 7 is what I use for Ghost Recon, because we also use this kind of strict list.
Yeah. So this is really handy to find. Like this is just, like I said, information that floats online. This as well here comes from a presentation, like a bunch of measured light values expressed in lux. So basically, this helps me defining if my physical values are correct. To basically like, get all the correct.
So exposure value basically comes, I think, from photography, more or less, right?
Yeah. Exposure value. I don't know the exact equation, but it's like a mathematical equation where you set your EV to a certain value, and based on what your shutter speed and aperture is, it will always that results in an exposure value. It's basically an equation with shutter speed, aperture, and ISO, and that totals out to an exposure value.
And the lux, as you mentioned, is a type of measurement of the light, and it's measured by the light meters, so it's physical based at least.
Yeah.
Exposure values is technical based, arguably, while lux is actually scientifically based.
I would say so. Lux to me is more of a measurement of how bright a light source is. To me, an exposure value is more of like, how should I expose my scene to look properly exposed.
Yeah.
I know people are using exposure values for measuring light intensities, but I think it's a little more confusing, because where exposure values come from, they come from photography, they come from the values that we discussed: aperture, shutter speed, ISO. So I think it makes more sense to differentiate between the two and use exposure values for exposing your scene, and lux and candela and nits, or whatever you want to use for light measuring, I would use that for measuring your actual light sources.
So if I remember the reason for this, maybe I remember wrong, but that's because our eyes obviously does all the work naturally.
Yeah.
So we can see everything, and we can see up to 20. And if I remember my research, cameras today, they go from 10 to 15, so they don't actually go all the way to the dark or all the way to the bright. And that's kind of why we have this measurement. And why do we need this in Unreal? Is this something related to also grayscale, automatic gray values, or is it?
Yeah. So so this is a good base to start off of, because this is what you would need for proper exposure. So if we go back to Unreal, if our exposure compensation is 0, we always know that Unreal is going to try and make the average scene to mid-gray, or what Unreal perceives as mid-gray, which is for Unreal 18%, because 18% in whatever color space it is using is mid-gray for Unreal. So if you would fill a screen with something, this would be mid-gray according to Unreal. If you would fill a white, let's maybe put a white cube in here. Let's see. Yeah. So if I would fill the screen, with this white cube here, it would be a similar value as if we were looking straight up to the rocks, exposure value wise. And that's because Unreal is always exposing for mid-gray. And that's something that we don't always want. For example, if you want to look straight at the sun, we probably don't want to expose for mid-gray, because that would make our sky look quite dark. And if we look in the shade, that would make our shadows look quite bright. So we need to figure out a way, like a dynamic way, to make our shadows darker and our highlights brighter. And this is where this really underestimated tool comes really into place as exposure compensation curve, because this curve is a tool where you can actually, let me get rid of all of the points here. Let rebuild it. So this curve, what it basically does is it takes as input the average scene exposure, so the average scene EV100, the thing you see here, and it's going to map that on a curve. And based on what you want to achieve, you can say, okay, for an EV of 10, I want to underexpose by a stop or overexpose by a stop. So let's quickly make that then. So we were measuring, if you look at our scene, an EV of 9. I add a key here at about 9. So let's make the axis value 9. And let's underexpose by 1 stop, which is -1. So now if we look at our histogram, you can see we're measuring an EV of oh, actually, let's make this 10. So we're measuring an EV of 10, but the actual scene output, which is the white bar here, is an EV of 11. So that means it's underexposing by 1 stop. And as you could see, our shadows immediately went a tad darker as soon as I did this. So 0, which is going back to an EV of 10, and now going back to -1, and you can see it goes a lot darker. Obviously, this now is our entire curve, which is just a flat line. So that would mean that if we would look straight towards the sun, our exposure would undercompensate a bit. So it would basically like underexpose the sun by like a stop, which is probably not something that we want. So what I would do then is I would look straight into the sun. Okay, I'm measuring something about like 13.5. I would add another key in here and say, okay, for an EV of 13, I want to not underexpose, but maybe like overexpose by a half a stop to like give like the brightness of the sun back. And this makes it dynamic. So at an EV of 13, we're having an overexposure of 0.5. At an EV of 10, we underexpose by 1. And it's basically going to blend between those two values. So if we see our X value is 11, we're going to underexpose by 0.25 stops. So this makes it whole dynamic and proactive in a way that if you move around in your scene, if you look straight up towards the sun, we're overexposing by half a stop, so it looks quite nice and bright. And if we go to our shadows, our EV is still decent enough that our shadows still feel like shadow and they don't like overblow a bit. So if you turn off this curve, you can see our shadows look really, really bright, and that's usually what art directors and art leads don't really, really like. And you can see in the distance the mountains here don't look really nice as well. So that's where I use this exposure compensation curve for. Another thing to keep in mind as well is that currently with our histogram, we are using a lot of values, like a ton of values. Like we're going from EV -10 to EV 20. And obviously during this static light setup, we don't really need that many EVs. So what you can do is basically like curb that in the advanced section and like basically make sure that, oh, maybe I don't want any values to go below 4, or no values in my entire scene go below 4, and no values in my entire scene go above 20. Maybe that's even a bit much. Maybe let's say 17. And this basically like gives us more values to play with, because if you see our histogram now, there's a lot more bars that represent our lighting in our scene. So if we reset this, you can see there's a lot less info for Unreal to play with. But if we undo this, we can see we have a lot more values and a range to play with and look around with, and like basically play around with its exposure. So yeah, that's where I would start. And then I would, so the min and max EV is basically telling Unreal where it should stop measuring its histogram. So maybe I don't want to measure anything beyond an EV of 7. So I can set this to a minimum of 7 and a maximum of, I don't know, maybe 15. And then this is our exposure histogram for this scene, which should work fine for this entire level here. And I have this little cube set up here with light in zone exterior and interior. So if you go in the interior, it should still behave really, really nice. Go back to the exterior, and whites still look like, and whites still look like white.
Cool.
Yeah, so that's how I would set up exposure in Unreal.
And this is useful also in general. Like you said it's a good base, even if you go for stylized, it's a good way to start with a base and then stylize afterwards rather than stylize randomly from the beginning. Isn't that correct? That's your recommendation, right?
Yeah, it's good to understand how it works, because with physical values, I think it's easier, because all of this information is known and you can find it. With stylized, it's a little bit harder or trickier to get the exposure just right, because it's more guesswork. Say, for example, your sun is 100 lux instead of, or even like 3.14. Because I know a lot of people say, oh, a sun of 3.14 is amazing, is what you need. But that would basically make your exposure value really, really low. That would basically give you in CNEV of about like 2 or 3 even, which is really, really low. And you probably want, I mean, you don't have that much range to play with anymore because you already have a very, very low sun. That's where you would have to like guess all of your exposure values, because yeah, you don't really have any ground truth.
I saw some tutorials where very popular tutorials actually in their recent that someone was showing exposure and stuff, and he was just sliding the lux and like ignoring these things. And yeah, I think there's a lot of misinformation out there, not in terms of that you can't do it, but in terms of if you are aiming for PBR realistic rendering, there is a set way of approach of doing it. And if you are doing more creative version eyeballing like me, that's okay. But if your intention is to have like photorealistic lighting, like Nikhil asked earlier, these are of course this approach you would use in Unreal Engine.
Yeah, I would say like there's no, I mean, wrong way of doing it. If it looks good, it looks good. But I've found this method very successful in a way that it is super dynamic. I can go from exterior to interior just fine without any hitches. Yeah, this basically gives me like all of the playing room, all of the wiggle playing room that I need for making a dynamic scenario like a game.
Right. For the people who at least commented, Nikhil, Anupam, Sergi, Pablo, thanks for leaving a comment. For the rest of people still watching or watch this video later, normally that's more the case. Please like, please subscribe, please share. These are very useful content that I think a lot of people who were in our situation a couple of years ago would have appreciated this. That's why I'm doing it, to make your life easier. And that's why Sander is doing it, to make your life easier. Is there anything you want to end with, Sander? Is there anything you would like to promote, mention?
Yeah, so if you're interested in doing lighting, like, yeah, that's really nice, because like I said, we really need more lighting artists, like good lighting artists in the industry. Keep on going, and don't just take anything just for granted. The information you find, try to like understand where it comes from and be proactive about it, and like try to find how you could apply the information you find on your work, and if it's the right way of doing things. Like, always question the stuff you find online, because like we said, there is a lot of different conflicting opinions about certain things like exposure. Find the right information and trust your gut feeling. That's what I would say.
That is probably true. A lot of people will say a lot of things. A lot of people will confuse you. It's probably a good idea to have some gut feeling trust yourself. The last thing I would like to remember to say to people is next week on Wednesday, June 9th, Vishesh Srivastava from Forza Studios will also be having an interview similar to this one. His background is from 2D to 3D to cinematic lighting artist. He's pretty good at still life rendering, so it's definitely also something I think Sander would tune into and appreciate to listen to as well. So I would like to say thank you for everyone for watching, and I will talk to Sander a little bit after now in private and catch up and kind of a tone down before we go our separate ways. No problem, Fateh. I mean, this is a recorded video, so feel free to watch it afterwards. I do appreciate that you come, even though you're late. And of course, just join the next live session if possible. So thanks for watching, and let's just say goodbye for the viewers. Goodbye.
Cheers. Bye bye. Have a nice day.